So start to share. All right. So can you see the title slide? I presume you
Hello.
can.
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Oh, hi. Welcome. So I got us started a little bit late, and maybe some people will join after we get started. But I have hit the record button, so they can watch it later to catch up if they missed some of the beginning. So welcome, Anthony and Tom. I think we have a great bit of content I want to share with you both, and for the folks that'll be watching later on the recording that couldn't make it in person. So my name is Mike Wilkes, and I am the Director of Cyber Operations for the Security Agency. We are a recently created startup here in New York City, and we have headquarters. I'm here in New York City. We have headquarters in Washington, Seattle area. And we're in the business of providing cybersecurity advisory. I like to call it governance as a service, where we put fractional CISOs, virtual CISOs into impactful positions and roles in small to medium-sized businesses, higher education, as well as municipalities and public sector agencies that, not everyone can afford to have a full-time headcount, but I think everyone does need and deserve to have a strategic plan and somebody operating and thinking on that level for the organization and to help manage and mitigate risk. Not in a tactical day-to-day manner necessarily, but more in a strategic plan. So what I've got with you or for you today is a reprise of a session that I delivered at the ISACA South Florida conference. I think it was back in February, if I remember correctly. And I didn't have an opportunity to record the presentation. And some folks that missed that session asked if I would, offer it up again. So now here we are recording it. So the concept is, the title is Pound of Cure. And this references, Benjamin Franklin, his, I guess you could call it a meme, right? It's from 1736, though, when he coined the phrase, "An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure." And I looked it up. He actually created this to remind the citizens of Philadelphia to remain vigilant about fire awareness and fire prevention. You can imagine, streets, sidewalks are made out of wood, buildings are made out of wood, and people leave maybe a candle burning, by the drapes by the window, and suddenly there's a fire and part of the city burns down. But of course, this particular phrase was not meant to keep people from knowing how to detect a fire and how to quickly put it out. But I do think that we've internalized this thought very much so in the cybersecurity space, where we put a lot of time and attention into prevention. And maybe, and I'm gonna make it a little bit more forceful, we definitely don't put enough time and attention into right of boom situation. In the military, they talk about boom when the bad things happen. So everything left of boom in a timeline sense is prevention. Everything right of boom is response and recovery. And if you look at some of the frameworks that we have for compliance, like NIST and others in the OT and IT space, there's almost like a 75% allocation to prevention. And if we assume breach, as we must in this modern day, threat actors will breach you. It's not a matter of if, but when, and maybe how often. We need to think about right of boom a little bit more, maybe. If we only have 25% of our budget or our mind share allocated to what happens after you get compromised, then I think the impacts are more long lasting. The recovery takes longer. And so I think it's useful for us to think about failure. And that's why I subtitled this Musings on the Evolution of Thinking About Failure, because that was the theme of the ISACA conference, was evolve or fail. And I kind of wanted to flip that on its edge and say failure is the secret to success, but only if we embrace failure and we learn from failure and we don't just sort of try to recover to the point in time prior to the breach, right? And to have a backup and to restore from that backup. That's a useful mitigation for a ransomware attack, for example. But at that point in time, you were vulnerable. and you were attacked successfully and breached. And so I think we need to have a much more, resilience focused approach to failure, and think about how we can make more robust, fault tolerant, trustworthy systems that assume breach and that assume failure. I often talk about breach cadence instead of breach likelihood in my teaching at NYU and other places, because some companies are getting breached every 6 months. It seems like T-Mobile is having a bad day, at least twice a year. And of course, Okta had several breaches in the last year, but it wasn't actually Okta, was it? It was their third parties, their service providers that were attacked. And I'll get into a little bit about that as well, talking about third-party risk and supply chain attacks. So I think that we are navigating right now a risk management future where the practice of risk management has to, deal with increasingly large doses of cybersecurity risks and threats. And our discussions with our colleagues and regulators and boards of directors, I think we need to make a mental shift away from what feels like this prevention bias. I think I said, we need to assume breach and we cannot fear it. Nicholas Taleb wrote a book called Anti-Fragile, and he talks about how human bones actually become stronger when they're subjected to force. And I think that's something that we need to try to seek out as we build, like I said, robust systems in order to deliver, this kind of resilient capability. So this particular set of musings and thoughts and questions explores our evolution of thought surrounding failure in a philosophical and a bit of a cultural context as digital defenders of, the infrastructure and our economy against those who would deign, to do us harm. And of course, threat actors these days includes not just nation states and organized crime. It also includes bored teenagers. And they're doing it for the lulz, right? If you think about lapses, if you think about scatter spider, these threat actors aren't necessarily even asking for ransomware or ransom payments. They may be doing it because they want to unlock, the gating of a GPU from an NVIDIA, network card that's used for, Bitcoin mining or Ethereum mining. And so they're doing it for different reasons. And I've heard actually from the CTO of Mandiant, Charles Carmichael, at a conference session that he gave here in New York at Google's offices. He talked about how they're bringing a high school guidance counselor onto ransomware calls these days because they have to deal with the angst-ridden sort of emotional issues of teenagers in negotiating ransom or sometimes getting the keys to decrypt just by talking them through it, because maybe they're being bullied and maybe they want to do these crimes and these breaches in order to impress their friends or to, stop from being bullied. So I think that's a new development. I like to refer to that as the democratization of crime. Anyone can be a nation state threat actor these days, especially with tools like ChatGPT and large language models, lowering the bar of entry, I guess you could say. So I'm going to pick up and talk about some anecdotes along the way. A little bit about myself before we dive into the agenda. So I've been doing infrastructure and security for over 30 years. I graduated from Stanford with a master's degree in philosophy of education. I went to go work for the Department of Education in a think tank in San Francisco called the Far Western Laboratory, where I was responsible for California, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah, K through 12 public education, educational technology grants, model technology schools, distance learning, all sorts of elements of what is still the practice today, right, for how people perform online and virtual education, certainly after the changes to society that COVID and lockdown brought. And I wrote a book for Cisco Press in 2002 for a certification that doesn't exist anymore, and it was called Internet Solution Specialist. I ran the team that launched Starbucks.com back in 1998, working in organic online, one of the first web design houses. Also gave birth to PlayStation.com for the PS2, rewrote and launched a whole new application stack there, as well as things like Blockbuster and Macy's and things like that. So I was pretty fortunate to be a part of what I call the roaring 20s of my generation. I'm not sure how old you are on the call today, but certainly felt like a time of exuberance and anything was possible. Of course, now the internet hasn't really panned out to be this wonderful utopian tool that we had all hoped for back in those days. But I decided to quit organic and moved to Europe and lived and worked in Amsterdam for 11 years, where I built and designed Rabobank's mobile virtual network operator for Rabomobile, as well as their direct banks for Ireland, UK, Belgium, Netherlands, Australia, New Zealand. And also led the team that built ING's DR infrastructure as part of the Nederlandse Bank requirements. And then built critical infrastructure for Nuon and Vattenfall and ING. So this was mission critical energy management systems that control power plants. So I've done more than just protect, online presence, but also real world mission critical infrastructure. Anyway, a couple other logos that are on here. I was the enterprise server platform lead for the CME, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And I ran an infrastructure of 10,000 servers with $2 quadrillion in contracts traded back in 2014. Then when I pivoted to work at Marvel, lovely storytelling there. People love to hear about my time as the head of security. I was also the head of DevOps and enterprise architecture. And I like to joke it was my job to keep Iron Man safe when I was there. But fill in the blank for any of the 5,000 or so characters in the universe. And we were attacked by rabid fans, 100,000 times a day, as much as we were by nation states and organized crime. So a lot of good lessons learned there. Then I was, began teaching at NYU. I'm an adjunct professor teaching cybersecurity, and I'm also a member of the World Economic Forum. I was nominated as a technology pioneer in 2020, working in the oil and gas cybersecurity resilience working groups, writing white papers and case studies. And then most recently, I was asked to join the quantum security working group, which is a topic for another time, but it's certainly super sexy if you think about the hype around AI and machine learning these days. Just imagine quantum machine learning, right? And put those two together. That would really blow everyone's marketing minds to be able to deliver on what the promise of those two terms and concepts might have. And now, of course, I am the director of operations at the security agency, abbreviated TSA. Because there's no such thing as a well-known three-letter acronym agency under TSA, right? Or at least we want to be the one that people trust and love, as opposed to just take their shoes off for security theater at the airport. What else? I guess that's about it. Let's dive into the agenda. So, dimensions and definitions of failure. And then I'll just dive into cognitive bias, systemic risk, focus on resilience as a defining characteristic of a sort of gestalt shift or mind shift on how we approach failure, and then embracing failure as an advantage. So here we have dimensions and definitions of failure. So what is failure? A not so helpful definition is the lack of success, right? So to define something as the lack of something else is not very helpful. Other dictionary entries talk about a cessation of power, as in a power outage or power failure, or omission of an expected or required action. And I think Thomas Edison's quote about the invention of the light bulb feels like it actually captures a good essence of the word. In this case, he said, "I have not failed. I just found 10,000 ways that it won't work." So that's a very optimistic approach, of course, to experimentation and entrepreneurship and invention. The word itself, failure, comes from the Latin word fallere, and it means to deceive or to disappoint. And having studied the philosophy of education, I'm always thinking about definitions of words and assumptions that are made in our thinking about different concepts, because the words that we use, they define the locus of debate and discussion. And for many years, I think the education system, for example, had a bias towards nature when you think about nature nurture questions. And thinking about the failure of students, there were words that were used like born too late, moron, ne'er do well, right? Never do well. And over time, these words fell out of use as our understanding of education and learning and cognition improved. And they were replaced by terms that indicates a failure of nurture instead of a failure in the nature of the person, such as retarded, handicapped, dropouts, or left behind. So retarded meaning kept back. And so I think there's a useful YouTube video here that I like to reference in the slide notes. And feel free, I have a QR code at the end of the deck where you can send me an email. It's just a mail to tag to request a copy of the presentation if you'd like to look at some of the hyperlinks and some of the content that I refer to, they're in the speaker notes, and I send the full deck to anyone that wants it. All right, so dimensions. There's different kinds of failure, and this is not exhaustive, but these are some of the ones that came up when I was thinking about, what are different flavors of failure. And so you have common failure, you have abject failure, glorious failure. I actually enjoy that one because that's almost, enjoying, the failure. And then, of course, cascade failures, complex failures, preventable failures, intelligent failures, singular, mechanical, fast fail, right? Remember, that's sort of like the internet's mantra: fail fast and move forward. And then prolonged failures, and of course, cognitive failures, which is one of the ones that I like to dive into. There's definitely, you can get a different sense, right, of how these failures differ in terms of the suggested causes and implications, and the attitude and perception around the kind of failure that's envisioned. And so I think one of the really powerful treatments of the word was expressed in a 2009 Honda advertising campaign that declared failure is the secret to success. And it echoes Thomas Edison's attitude. So let me throw this into the chat real quick, just for those that want to check it out before you ask for a copy of the deck. This is a link to one of the ads that was run in that campaign, which I found quite moving. I've used it in presentations and analysis of thinking about failure from many different locations, teaching and also in companies that I've worked in. Next up, the cognitive element, right? Cognitive failure. I think this is one of the biggest failures, is a lack of understanding of cyber risk at the executive level right now. I don't think the top of the org chart is pulling their weight. Everyone else, in my mind, individual contributors, middle managers, all sorts of people, are doing their best to help improve our security posture. And I think it's the executive and boards that are almost like deer caught in the headlights and saying, cyber what? I have to do what now? And of course, the SEC and other regulatory bodies are trying to make it more accountable at the top. And I think they agree by this focus that there's not enough understanding of this risk, and therefore not enough resources allocated, not enough prioritization to avoiding some of these avoidable failures and breaches. And so what are some of the cognitive risks that we're stuck with today, right? Some of these risks that we don't really try to address because they're too deep-seated and they feel insurmountable. Or in the case of like SolarWinds, they feel improbable. I don't know how many people would have entertained, what if, Russian Cozy Bear APT-29 threat actor group decided to, inject a backdoor into SolarWinds Orion remote monitoring and management software, and then infected, thousands of companies and hundreds of government agencies, including, I think, 17 attorney general's offices, NVIDIA and Department of Energy and others. And so it's a huge, impact for that one. And it's a bit of a poster child, although along came the Kaseya breach and violation of their monitoring software. And I think it was DarkSide or Revil, I think it was, that used their software to distribute ransomware. And so if your security is good, that of your third parties and your providers is going to be potentially weaker. And the weakest link is the one that'll be attacked. And that's the one that'll cause grief for you, because it's not your security. It was one of your vendors or one of your service providers that got compromised. In terms of cognitive risk, I think the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster in 1986 is a really good example of cognitive risk. There was a culture of launch is a go. And this managed, because of this culture and this bias, this cognitive bias, it managed to keep engineers who knew that the O-rings were subject to cold temperatures overnight from stopping the launch. Management failed, not for a lack of knowledge or technique or control systems in engineering, but for a belief. Some engineers, Bob Ebeling, for example, was one of the 5 booster rocket engineers in Morton Feigl. He tried to bring this fact to light prior to the launch, but he was unsuccessful at that. Risk perception. There's a lovely TED Talk from Bruce Schneier shown here, where he, from 2010, talking about this idea of the feeling of security is often discrete from the reality of security. And this is where you get snake oil salesmen and security theater, where people are going through the motions, but not necessarily really mitigating risk and having a real security posture. So I think some of the characteristics that he points out is that there's a bias that emerges, again, cognitive risk around the exaggeration of spectacular, where we downplay, of the common risks. So, for example, flights, airplanes, airplane crashes versus driving. The loss of life for driving in automobile accidents is way higher than flying, but people still have this, spectacular, fascination with plane crashes, even though it's statistically one of the safest methods of transport, at least until Boeing was being managed by or mismanaged by accountants and lawyers that didn't understand operational security and quality control. But the second one is unknown versus the familiar. So in this case, think about stranger danger. People are always talking about kidnapping by strangers. That's not statistically correct. Kidnapping happens by relatives and by people you know, and so there's this sort of bias towards the unknown, or at least fear of the unknown. And then personified risks is an element as well that heightens our perception of risk as opposed to actual risk. So when you give someone a name and you call out their name, like Bin Laden, he becomes more scary because he has a name, right? It's not just the Taliban or something, right? And of course, the element of control is an element, a dimension of risk perception. So we underestimate when we're in control, and we overestimate the risk perception when we are not in control, when we're at the mercy of someone else's decisions and ability to mitigate risk. So this is a really great talk, like I said, that he has, that I pulled a couple of these comments and concepts out here for you. And I'll put that into the chat as well. It goes into the recording. This is the Bruce Schneier link on reconceptualizing security, which is what I'm trying to do here a little bit as well. So let's dive into the Ben Franklin. There is a prevention bias, as I mentioned at the beginning, in budgets and in our compliance frameworks. So what is prevention bias? In this case, it's a tendency to focus on preventative measures at the expense of detection and response. And in part, I think it's due to beliefs and feelings rather than facts. So it could just be, like I mentioned, that we've all just internalized the wisdom of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But a recent review of IT and OT standards, regulations, and best practices by Dragos.com, which is in the OT space, the CTO and founder, Rob Lee, I met through the World Economic Forum, and he's a brilliant mind doing really great work in the OT space. Their blog post clearly demonstrates that we have managed to codify our prevention bias. And they calculated, like I said, about 75% of controls across various frameworks in OT space, at least, are focused on prevention, leaving, like I said, only 25% for response and recovery. And so I think Benjamin Franklin is to blame in some regards for this meme that has infected us. And I think we need to take a step back. Like I said, it wasn't meant to stop people from knowing how to put out a fire, right? You need to know how to put out fires as well. Let's see, additional sources of cognitive bias are affinity bias. In this case, we subconsciously gravitate towards people who we feel share our interests, our beliefs, and our background. Then there's another category of bias, attribution bias. This is the tendency to explain the person's behavior by referring to their character rather than actual situational facts and factors. Anchoring bias. This is relying too heavily on the first piece of information that we are given about a topic. So, for example, Hafnium was a group that Microsoft named in the Microsoft proxy logon attacks, where on-prem Exchange servers had a series of vulnerabilities that allowed remote code execution and privilege escalation. So you can become an administrator on an Exchange server. And of course, it didn't affect cloud. It affected on-prem instances because Microsoft patched it for their cloud instances pretty quickly. And there were thousands of companies that were vulnerable and remained vulnerable for months, even after the vulnerabilities were discovered and disclosed and patches remained available. And so this anchoring bias came in the reporting around this, which was that Hafnium is a Chinese threat actor group. But when I was working at Security Scorecard previously, where I was the CISO and now an advisor in full transparency, the the threat intelligence team that we had and have was able to actually discern that it was the Russians that had actually put these web shells installed on these exchange servers. But they were trying to do a false flag operation to blame the Chinese. And of course, the first thing everyone heard was the Chinese are attacking Microsoft vulnerabilities in the proxy logon situation. They get logos and brand and names for these vulnerabilities sometimes. So anyway, anchoring bias is very real, and it's very hard to undo. You can't sort of go back and have everyone relearn who the threat actor was. Especially in case of attribution, it's difficult sometimes because of these efforts to disguise who the actual threat actor is. Then there's outcome bias, which is a tendency to judge a decision based on its outcome rather than basing on the assessment of the quality of the decision at the time it was made. So think of this as, hindsight is 2020. Everyone gets to see clearly after the fact, oh, you should have made this decision, right? You're second guessing choices. We really shouldn't do that in terms of outcome bias. We should be thinking about what we knew at the time that we knew it. Then action bias, this is where people tend to favor action over inaction, right? It's like up and over, right? World War II trench or warfare, maybe World War I actually. Trench warfare had this concept of, even though it's impossible and it's a death sentence, you're going to go up and over and try to take the next line in the war, in the battlefront. And I think that obviously there's the opposite end of the spectrum, which is analysis paralysis, where people are forever sharpening their sword and never going into battle. So these are two ends of the spectrum, of a sort of spectrum of pathologies, I guess, where you have action bias on one end and analysis paralysis on the other. I've worked in organizations where one team was entirely, analysis paralysis and didn't do anything. They just kept thinking about doing things. And another team just kept doing things without a plan. And I didn't think either one was terribly healthy in that regard. And let's see, even if there's no indication that taking action is going to have a better result, people still just want to do. I think that's a pretty American approach, actually, in terms of innovation and energy and fail fast and fix forward, that kind of thinking. And of course, it can go too far. And then lastly, you may have heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect, which occurs when a person's lack of knowledge and skills in certain areas cause them to actually overestimate their own competence. So these are just a few of them, of course, and we can think about how to avoid them by detecting them in yourself and in others. Cognitive bias, too big to fail. This is a theory in banking, for example, that certain corporations are so large that their failure would be disastrous to the greater economic system, and therefore they're supported by governments and bailouts when they face potential failure. But I think we're robbing the market of a healthy feedback mechanism and the feedback loop. So even the mighty and super scaled Amazon Web Services has demonstrated, for example, that they are not too big to fail. A November 2020 outage, for example, and there's been several, but this is the one I like to refer to. It was eventually attributed to a front-end fleet of servers that ran into a default max threads limit for Linux. And a good number of companies, they realized just what concentration risk means when thinking about how dependent so many businesses are on the proper functioning of Amazon's US East region. There's way too much critical infrastructure, aka single points of failure. They're actually operating in just one availability zone, US East, or in one region. And within US East, like 1A or something, it's like the default zone everyone deploys infrastructure into. Shown here is Randolph and Mortimer Duke, the main antagonist characters from the 1983 film Trading Places, where the stereotypes, of course, of male, board directors, white male board directors. I think that's also a cognitive bias in terms of boards and education and executive leadership. In this case, another cognitive bias example would be the ERCOT, the Electricity Reliability Council of Texas. So remember that 2021 storm that moved through and caused a cascade failure of the network. And I think they were about 40 seconds away from reaching what's called a black start event, where the entire grid would have been offline for like 6 months or longer, because it went very precariously close to going out of balance. And that's shown here is a slide actually from the board meeting, the next meeting they had. It's an open meeting. I joined it. I dialed in. I have a copy of the presentation here in the links in the slides. I can put that, copy that into the chat as well. just to sort of read, and go through the readout of what happened and how, Texas was almost living in the Stone Ages for a while. Can you imagine not just no electricity, but like no cell phone services, because a lot of the infrastructure would have stopped working if the entire grid had been cascade failed. And so this is something that a lot of teams train for, having worked in energy management systems in Europe, but most of them, almost all of them actually, have never actually experienced this kind of an event, this black start, where you have to reset the entire system and bring it back up piece by piece. And so their focus for ERCOT was on market price and isolating their network from the rest of the grid, because of course, if it were connected properly to the rest of the country, they could have just gotten, kilowatts, from other regions that had functioning generation and power plants. Texas, like I said, was just minutes away. And I don't do this to make fun of Texas and to blame them or shame them. I think this kind of event is in all of our futures, given the current state of how fragile critical infrastructure is. It's barely held together with duct tape and baling wire. And of course, if it's a nation state threat actor that's actually trying to tip it over, it's very easy for them to do so. I actually predict, like, by the year 2025 or so, China will invade Taiwan. Taiwan will say, okay, we're good with that. The US won't be good with that. They're going to want to intervene, but China has a bunch of sleepers and a whole bunch of, infrastructure backdoors and, compromises that they've been waiting to invoke. And so they're going to distract us, I believe, at that time. And they're going to cause major, major outages and disruptions to keep the US from intervening on that invasion of Taiwan. Like I said, which will probably happen in the next year or two. So look forward to, or don't look forward to, the date when that happens, because you can imagine, the power grid may go offline. Communications networks may die. Ships and transport and critical infrastructure, could get all jammed up due to, like I said, backdoors in firmware and compromised remote access vulnerabilities that will be invoked. Next up, systemic risk. Systemic risk is an emergent property of complex systems. What does that mean? It means that it emerges from no one specific component of the system. It actually emerges as an aggregate, right, from the unpredictable risk factors that are fluid and evolving within complex systems with multiple parts. Numerosity, linearity, sensitivity to initial conditions, like cascade failures for example, the coral reef is a fragile ecosystem as well. But also, if you think about it in cryptography, if you have a weak source of entropy to generate your seed, for the encryption, then it's actually guessable in some cases. Like if a virtual machine starts up and it has no entropy, it has no source of randomness, it will constantly pick a number. It's like asking Alexa or something. Alexa picks a number between 1 and 10, and it keeps saying 7. So pick a number between 1 and 10, and it keeps saying 7, right? This is sort of what's happening, right? So it becomes predictable. And that's why we have to worry about good sources of randomness when you're creating a private key or when you're standing up PKI, public key infrastructure encryption. Anyway, that's a little bit of a digression. But how do we address the uncertainty of these increasingly complex systems that we don't fully understand? Shown here is a satellite image from 2003. There was this massive northeastern power blackout. That's not just clouds causing a lack of lights to be seen in this satellite photo. And the blackout's proximate cause was a software bug in the alarm system at the control room of First Energy. This is an Akron, Ohio-based company, which rendered operators unaware of the need to redistribute the load after a transmission line kind of drooped and touched foliage, because as it gets hot, the copper expands and it droops for above ground transmission lines. So what should have been a manageable local blackout cascaded into the collapse of much of the entire Northeast region. And there's a good definition of complex systems. These are the things I mentioned before. There's 4 parameters that contribute to complexity in complex systems: numerosity, nonlinearity, connectivity and dependency of these elements, and then adaptation, actually. So I said, like, fulcrums often exist in a complex system, which can pivot the system based on elements which occupy a critical path to some of the flows, whether that's data, power, communication, influence. And of course, there's this action at a distance effect that's happening. Shown here are the visual an artist's visualization of quantum entanglement, perhaps one of the best modern examples of complex systems, because Einstein described, quantum as spooky action at a distance. We don't know why, for example, these molecules or atoms, or elements, quantum particles can become entangled and still reflect what's happening to another one, even though it's 1,000 miles away. So diving a little bit quickly into complexity, numerosity. This means many parts, right? Many elements. And it's not just a jar of marbles, because all those marbles are pretty much the same. We're talking about, oops, hang on, how did that pop away? I think I typed a key accidentally. Anyway, so complex systems are not reducible to their isolated components. They have a certain behavior and a certain texture, and a certain composition, because they have all of these different systems. And a system, if you take it up a scale, becomes an ecosystem, and an ecosystem, take it up the scale in inclusion, reaches the biosphere. So if we think about systemic risk, you could think about ecosystemic risk and biospheric risk. I'm thinking, what is the infosec equivalent of the biosphere? Like the entire northern hemisphere of telecommunications infrastructure. Shown here is a spiral honeycomb made by bees. There are 31 species of tetragonula bees native to Oceania, and these bees are often differentiated by the pattern of the hive that they create. And researchers suggest that the details of an individual worker bee's rules might be genetically encoded to create this complex structure, right? This particular spiral honeycomb shape. Non-linearity, the other second feature or component of complexity, where multi-level elementary interactions create feedback loops. And as I referred to before, the possibility of phase transitions, where you have sensitivity to initial conditions like a coral reef collapse or market collapses and crashes on the stock market. In this case, we're talking about things like 1 + 1 is not equal to 2. 1 + 1 could be equal to 0. If you think about inverse, sound waves, like my noise canceling headphones, it produces the inverse wave of the sounds outside of my ears, and they cancel each other out. 1 + 1 is equal to 0. Although technically it's 1 ± -1, but you get what I'm saying, I think. And then 1 + 1 is equal to 3. This is where the sum of the parts, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. This is synergy, the concept of synergistic relationships between components. Chaos theory tells us about some of these elements that express sensitivity to initial conditions. Like I said, salt values in crypto and encryption, and sources of entropy and random number generation. Shown here is a healthy coral on the left, and then a bleached fire coral on the right. A couple of years ago, I had put together this as part of one of my slides for my course that I teach at NYU, and I reused the image here. It's the Australia's Great Barrier Reef had lost like half of its corals in the last few years. So these, again, cascade failures due to systemic risk. And then lastly, I think it's this is the third one, connectivity. This is the density of connections, or the emergent properties, has more to do with these connections than with the properties of any node or element of the network itself. So think about IPv4 network connectivity, and think about overlay networks, for example, and how it's not necessarily any one IP address that's causing this risk. It's an emergent property of the fact that all of these different services are dependent on each other. And when somebody attacks, tiny DNS or a fat-fingered outage caused in AWS, it causes a cascade failure of more than just a regular percentage of the internet stops working. And that's what I mentioned about the connectivity element. So not all measures of connectivity, however, are dependent upon the pure density or the strength of the connections. There's also an important network graph concept here that deals with the strength of weak connections, or the strength of weak ties in a social network, like getting a job through serendipitous conversation at a cocktail party, rather than getting a job through your former employer, or someone that you've worked with for many years, or someone that's in your direct first-degree network. So it helps, actually, these weak connections, the strength of weak connections, it actually helps define your position in a non-Euclidean space of the internet. Here is shown a visualization of the email boxes that were collected as a part of the Enron investigation, which shows the email links between people. And you can see clearly patterns in this visualization. That's the kind of thing that happens with network and social graph analysis as well. And then, of course, adaptation is the fourth element of complexity. And in here, we're talking about degrees of autonomy of the member elements of a complex system. So if one simply, rules and logic gates are in operation, then the system is not going to be complex, right? If you have simple rules, right, and simple logic gates. So there needs to be an adaptive function happening. So the question here I put in my notes is it true that high levels of diversity in a complex system, let's say like the tidal pools of the Sea of Cortez, below the Baja California. I think it was John Steinbeck wrote a novel about the Sea of Cortez with Ed Ricketts, his character from Cannery Row. But anyway, it was a real person, actually. It equates itself to the resilience, I think, having diverse biodiversity, essentially, is a resilience function. It's not like the potato famine that happened in Ireland, where it was a monoculture wiped out by one blight, one pest, or bacteria, maybe. Anyway, so I think good health of a complex system could be due to its diversity. And there are likely complex systems that have low diversity, and I need to get some examples of those maybe. But shown here is the excavation of a giant anthill. So each one of these is a different path that had evolved organically and adapted by the ant colony over time. And you can see the workers here, exploring that because they had poured concrete into all the passages of the anthill to explore its nature and its design, and then excavate out the dirt. So what do we actually engineer systems in 2024 is a question that I like to ask. Or are they simply assembled without any kind of intelligent design, inspired by fashion and technology hype cycles, through Gartner and Forrester reports? Kubernetes, everyone needs Kubernetes. Well, I don't know. Kubernetes might be a solution looking for a problem, or blockchain and distributed ledger has for many years tried to find a problem to be solved. It is a solution, and it's an interesting, fascinating solution to audit and transaction records, and having an immutable shared ledger, which has value for its transparency. But again, like I said, I think that there's certain elements of chaos that are in flight, and not in a good way. But I do want to mention a good chaos, which is called security chaos engineering. This is a healthy reaction to the ever-increasing complexity of systemic risk, and thoughtful experimentation is the key to finding new ways forward. So if you've heard of the Netflix Chaos Monkey, they actually wrote code that would go into their production Amazon instance on AWS and destroy random components of load balancers and clusters and network connections, just to demonstrably prove that they had a fault-tolerant architecture. And so they actually, how much confidence does it take, if you'd actually write code that would randomly cause failures in production? And of course, it became the Simian Army when they open sourced it. And then since then, it has evolved into a lovely book written by Kelly Shortridge and Aaron Reinhardt. And I'll put a link to that in the chat, called Security Chaos Engineering, and how we build sustainable, fault-tolerant, trustworthy systems. And that's one way to do it, the evolution of thinking that came from the Chaos Monkey. And so I think systems engineering in 2024 is messy. Not Lionel Messi, the soccer player, but messy as in ugly and not orderly. I think it's like Spumoni ice cream, if you're familiar with it. So you mash together a little scoop of pistachio and a scoop of vanilla or chocolate, strawberry, and then they take a slice of it. And I think that's our infrastructure these days, Spumoni. And of course, with companies acquiring other companies, they often don't actually merge them properly. And so it's not really, a suite of tools. It's just a hodgepodge. And I think systems are less engineered these days than sort of assembled quasi-organically by gluing together various components that we want to have involved in the solution or the platform. Shown here is a runtime dependency graph of Mozilla Firefox, for example. So I think of that as kind of messy. So this is the way. How do we mitigate these risks? Well, we mitigate cognitive risk by working to unbias ourselves. All of those biases that I listed, we need to become aware of them and to be able to detect them in ourselves and call them out in accountable, respectful, tactful ways when we see them in others. And we need to address systemic risk by embracing failure and not fearing it, and running thoughtful failure experiments to figure out if something's going to fail, how will it fail, rather than waiting for the threat actors to cause the failure, or waiting for Mother Nature to deliver a hurricane, a tornado, a fire, or other type of force majeure. General techniques to unbias. Creating awareness of it helps, right? If you become aware of the bias, you can start to mitigate it. We can standardize certain decision processes rather than let people take decisions on their gut, so to speak, although there is something to be said for gut thinking. Improve our fact presentation and our attribution of facts and our trust and belief in actual existence of facts. As a quick aside, I like to capture this phrase I heard many years ago and to relay it in almost all of the presentations that I do, which is in the age of information, ignorance is a choice. And I think that's a challenge that we're facing as a society right now. A lot of people are choosing to be ignorant for various reasons, and to not believe that there is objective scientific fact, or at least approximations of truth that we can know and rely on. And of course, we can increase accountability and we can have more involvement in decisions that can help us get away from some of these biases. Cognitive risk against confirmation bias, you need to walk up to the data and you need to ask the data questions, and also be prepared to listen to the data and to not just have a hypothesis that you're waiting for the data to confirm, because you'll be discarding evidence that refutes your hypothesis when you have this cognitive bias or confirmation bias. So you need to hear what the data wants to tell you. You need to listen to it. You can combat prevention bias by allocating some more time and budget for response and recovery tools. And again, not just prevention tools like vulnerability scanning. Yes, it's true, you can eliminate risk by identifying vulnerabilities and patching them. But guess what? Of the thousands of vulnerabilities that are in the CVE database, right, that NIST provides for us to track, not every single high and critical will ever be a part of a breach. And people have done work on this. Michael Reutman of Kenna Security, which is purchased by Cisco a few years ago, he came up with the EPSS, which is a scoring system based on the likelihood that the vulnerability will be involved in a breach, based on machine learning analysis of a lot of incident response and breach data sets. And when he joined Cisco, they got access to all of Cisco's incident response events. And so they got to enrich that data model. And so we really just need to go after exploitable highs and criticals, not just absolute because it's a high or critical, which means we're wasting time and effort patching vulnerabilities that won't actually be exploited. Let's see what else. Combating prevention bias. Yeah. Identify your concentration risks by thinking about those too big to fail components of your platform. DNS, for example, is commonly overlooked single point of failure. And then, of course, we need to drop some of those old tired tropes that are used in our documentation in terms of word choice for things, because that causes cognitive bias and risk as well. Things like master slave for databases, whitelisting, blacklisting, right? You can talk about primary and replica. You can talk about allow list and deny list. It's just useful to not put up these stereotypical sort of emotion-laden terms that keep us using these words for things just out of habit. And then lastly, systemic risk. A supply chain is not 3 links long. It's not just your first degree upstream, you yourself, and your first degree downstream. All right. Pay attention to your third party risk, but also your fourth party risk, your fifth party risk, essentially your nth party risk, and continuously monitor their security posture with event-based assessments. Expand your understanding of your risk to the ecosystem level, not just to the system level. The Ever Given, when it launched itself sideways in the Suez Canal, gave the whole world a lesson in just how connected and dependent we are on single points of transport in the maritime sector, for example. And that was human error. Again, imagine if someone did this to certain choke points in the world, in certain ports. Certainly the Dali hitting that bridge in Baltimore was a bit of a wake-up call as well to the fact that human error can cause massive, unintended impact. But imagine if that had been, although technically I guess we don't know that it wasn't yet, what if that had been a cyber attack that caused the ship to lose power and crash into the bridge? So anyway, don't try to introduce the right kinds of changes into the wrong layers of a system as well. So there's this thing called pacing layers, which can be looked up. And it talks about how we can build resilience at different pacing layers. So on the outermost layer, you have like fashion and technology, and these are fickle and they change very quickly. And then eventually you work your way towards like systems and then governance and then like nature. Nature moves, at a very glacial pace compared to human innovation and changes. So don't try to introduce layer, change at the wrong layer. So focus on resilience. I got 4 slides left, 8 minutes. I'll try to finish this up. What is resilience? Sometimes it's defined as an object's ability to return to a normal shape after being subjected to force or extreme conditions. Here, I think of like a can of Coca-Cola being crushed. Someone pounds out the dents and makes it whole again. That's not a good definition of resilience for cyber. My preferred definition is not about restoring to the previous, function, and instead, it's about how do we improve and adapt and be transformed by forces of extreme and attacks and vulnerabilities. And so I think the first expression of the term originated in engineering. It has to do with tensile strength and ductile properties of metal and things like that, hammering out a dent on the fender of a Volkswagen. But it was the introduction of the ecological and psychological definition and expression of resilience, where the concept's less concerned, like I said, with returning to a former state than it is with coping with those and moving forward and being improved by the experience of the attack or the disruption. I think cyber resilience is more of a recent incantation, of this psychological and ecological sense of resilience. And we would do well to understand its uses in this domain. There's an old Chinese proverb, that the tree that is unbending is that is easily broken, which refers, I think, to the willow, Aesop's fable, where the willow survives the storm and the oak gets knocked over. And of course, over time, this fable has been used for different reasons and different messages, sometimes attributing cowardice, to the willow. But in other cases, we're talking about, the strong, the hard and strong will fail, the soft and the weak will overcome. That comes from the Tao Te Ching, if I remember correctly. And I already talked about Kelly Shortridge and anti-fragile, so I'll move on to the next slide. With our focus on resilience, we must assume breach. We must embrace failure and not fear it, right? Get on the other side of it, get comfortable with it, and learn how to stand back up quickly with confidence. And we need to seek indicators of robustness, adaptability, and transformability. These are 3 elements of resilience. So I think we need to cast off the shackles of a mindless adherence to the ritual of compliance as dutifully practiced by thousands of auditors and accountants. We must focus on resilience. In order to cast off those shackles. Resilience assumes failure, just as cybersecurity must assume compromise. The attackers will bypass your tools and your training. Of that, you can be certain. We must accept and embrace failure and not fear it. Resilience is also used, like I said, in ecology and psychology, where it helps us adapt and cope with those aforementioned extreme conditions. And then here, I have a quote from jazz. I'm a member of the National Jazz Museum in Harlem. I'm a board member. I'm a jazz musician. I'm an ASCAP member. I love bringing analogies in from music. And in this case, Dizzy Gillespie has a lovely quote about jazz. He says, in jazz, there are no mistakes, only opportunities. I think it's a rich, rich philosophy by which to live our lives. If somebody makes a quote unquote wrong note in a jazz quartet, if the rest of the quartet is listening, they can just go with it and they can make it the correct note. And that's an improvisation. And I think a sustainable approach to resilience and thinking about failure is to have a mindset that can improvise and that can adapt and that can make each potential failure into an opportunity to discover something new. The experimentation found in jazz music is a beautiful combination of structure and form with creativity and freedom. Freedom within the structure of a standard composition. So if we get a jazz quartet together, they all know these jazz standards, which would be like playbooks for incident response. You say, okay, let's play How High the Moon in F at this tempo, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, and everyone just goes and does it, and it's beautiful, and it's different every time it happens. I think that's something I'm going to pursue more with some potential meetings, talking about how we can learn some lessons for cybersecurity from music and from jazz. And of course, with my philosophical approach to all of these 2 things. Then finishing up, embracing failure as an advantage. Some cultures stigmatize failure much more than in the US. Singapore and Japan, for example, are two places where innovation is, in my understanding and analysis and others that I've read, innovation is actually held back because of the cultural norms around success and the stigmatization of failure. The evolution of advancement of technology often requires taking risks and embracing failure. This is why in InfoSec we're concerned with this concept of risk appetite. Not taking risks is itself a risk, right? A company can be disrupted, by an innovator, or by not wanting to give up, its love of profits for film if you're Kodak, and to make money off of the processing of physical film and to not embrace digital photography. They had the first digital cameras. This is one of those Harvard case studies that's always used in their business school. So I was fortunate, for example, to join the U.S. Chamber of Commerce trade delegation for Singapore's International Cybersecurity Week back in 2022, and to give a presentation that I had submitted for GovWare, which is an event that's larger and more prestigious than RSA in that region. And our week of activities involved meeting U.S. and foreign cybersecurity leadership. And it was there that I met Tommy Koh, who is ambassador at large for Singapore. And his remarks to us during a lunch that we had with him pointed out the fact that the U.S. companies enjoy this advantage of embracing failure as an advantage because of our cultural attitude towards failure, and embracing failure is one of the core strengths of our system. So that is it. Here's the QR code. Feel free to shoot your camera at it or send me an email. I am Wilkes at securityagencyusa.com, and just ask for a copy of the Pound of Cure presentation. And I'm also, of course, happy to connect with you on LinkedIn. My handle there is Eclecticus. And with the last minute, I can stop sharing and see if there's any questions or comments from the folks in the chat that are dialed in at the moment. Tom or Anthony, any quick questions or comments before we wrap? No, okay. I see a comment from Tom saying thanks much. Did you come off
No
mute there?
specific questions, but yeah, thanks for running us through it.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate your joining again, whether you're dialed in right now or watching again on the recording later. I'll send out a link to the recording if you want to share it with anyone that you think might enjoy watching this. And like I said, if you want a copy of the slides, I'm happy to send them to you. Thanks. Have a good afternoon.